Good morning and welcome to Tuesday morning's tutorial. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to go through the memo for the SIG test. Why we're doing this is so that you can see how we evaluated each question. So when you receive your question paper, we'll disclose to you in class how we're going to distribute them back to you, the marked papers that is. So you can go through it. If you see any issues, you can contact us and then we can just either have a look at it together or we can just correct it if there is a mistake. Please note that these tests were only marked by myself and Mr. Gottrell. We split the questions and he marked 2 questions and I marked 2 questions. And if there are any mistakes, you should contact us directly and then we'll go and look at the papers. Everything is stored. So we'll go and look at the stored paper and then determine if that mistake is valid or not. Now, as we go through this, this is recorded as well, so you can always go back to this when you go through your paper. Please keep in mind the steps that are required, because there are certain things that requires additional steps for you to get all of the marks. All right. So, before we start with that, are there any questions up till now regarding your semester test mark? Your mark will be released today. I'm still capturing. Sorry, I thought I was going to be done yesterday afternoon, but it took me a bit longer than expected. So I'm almost done with it. The marks will be released today. The moderator will go through the papers. Once the moderator has gone through the selected papers or subset of papers, then the marked version of the papers will be released to you. Now, we're either going to email that to your student account or your account linked to Eve, or we are going to upload it directly to your practical slot under semester test 1. But that we'll still decide on which route to take or which one will be the easiest to take. All right. So I don't see any questions, so let's get started with this. So firstly, we're going to look at the multiple choice questions. I must say I am slightly disappointed in the results here. The average here is between 3 and 4. I haven't really broken down my mark sheet to tell you exactly what the average is. I guess we'll do that in class once I have the class average. But these are multiple choice questions, and this is an open book exam or an open book test itself. Not sure if we listed it as open book in the guides, but we've told you in class it's open book. You have access to all of your slides, and all of these things were discussed in class. But this is the wrong paper. This is the SSA. That would be quite interesting if I showed you the SSA and half of you are like, I don't serve with this. This is the wrong paper. Let's see, main paper. There we go. All right. So these are all multiple choice question, open book. So you could have essentially just gone to your notes and you have had the answer. So question 1.1. So firstly, you have to select the correct answer or the most correct answer and then list that. Who was the mother of computer science? Now, let's see how many of you can remember this. Which one of these are the correct answers? Is the correct answer? C, that is correct. Lady Ada Lovelace is considered to be the mother of computer science. Then 1.2. Who was one of the first programmers? A, Grace Harper, no. So the answer here is between C and E. The answer is supposed to be E. For some reason, The version that was uploaded to Eve was not the version, which included a typo which made it grave, but it's supposed to be Grace Brewster Murray Hopper. She was the first programmer, but because of that small spelling typo, E was accepted as well. So technically, if you go based on the fact that the name is spelled incorrectly, the correct answer is E, but C was also accepted as that was the intended correct answer. Just for some reason, the wrong paper was uploaded. It still had that typo in it. All right. So the answer was between C and E, so both of those were considered correct. It was supposed to be C, and you'll see in a moment why it was supposed to be C. It's a little mean joke we played on all of you. So 1.3, what approach was used to obtain the 24 million details of South Africans from the Credit Bureau in 2020? Yes, C, social engineering. It was not hacked. It was not a phishing attack. It was not a Trojan horse. It was social engineering. The person simply walked in and asked for the details, claiming to be a client. True or false? Alan Turing is the inventor of the Enigma machine. C, once again. Now, how many of you panicked when you saw 4 C's in a row? Like, no, something is wrong here. It can't be all C's. It was supposed to be if there wasn't that small typo there. Most of you probably would not have even noticed the typo, but the Brewster would have thrown you off. Right, then 1.5. What is the name of the fastest supercomputer? Yes, E. None of the above. So the fastest supercomputer is not listed here. And no, it was not C. You notice that spelling is completely different. Right. So that's the multiple choice question. Fairly easy. So you've got C or E for 1.2. 1.3 is C, 1.4 is C, and 1.5 is E. Please note that wasn't the case for the SSA as well, for those that wrote the SSA. Now, the recursion question. I'm not going to ask you guys to remember this off by heart. In tonight's TUTS, we'll be discussing the solution to this as well, because there is one thing I added to this in the TUTS that I did with you that might have confused some of you, but I took that into consideration after the question itself. So the correct answer here, let me just maybe add something so that you can see the correct answer. Comment. So the correct answer here is A minus 1, C times B plus 5. That's 5. Now, those that did the TUT with me, I didn't explain things very clearly to you, and I might have slightly said something else. So what most of those that did the TUT with me would have had the following answer most likely. Would have had A minus 1, C times B plus C plus 1. C plus 2, depending on what you chose A to B, you would have had C plus 1, C plus 2, or potentially C. So I looked at your answer, I looked at the current value of C, and then I determined that last part based on what your current value is. So you got a mark for that, even though technically it's not correct. So just have a look at your paper. If it is wrong, just give you a second. So if it is wrong in terms of the overall formula, but it's correct in terms of the current value of your A, it was marked correctly. But if either one of those two were wrong, you lost 1 mark. And if you didn't show your calculations, but you had the correct mark, you lost 1 mark. And if your final mark was wrong, so if it was off by 1 value, we deducted 1 mark, but you showed your value, so you got 4 marks there. And if you showed the calculations, even if it was the wrong calculations and the wrong solution, you got 2 marks which were bracketed, which counts as pity marks. All right, then question?
So isn't the answer A minus 1 times C to the, actually towards the answer, isn't it A plus 1 instead of C plus 1?
How do you mean? There's no, oh.
A.
I mean
yeah.
A, sorry.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, sorry, I meant A, because if you wrote it in terms of A, because the A is the only numerical value add. Yes, thank you for that. Right. I'm assuming that's your question, so if you can just lower your hand, or is this something else? Okay. All right. So to get 5 marks, you had to show the calculations as well, which is the trace table. And if you attended my TUT or Ms. Gottschall's TUT, you would have seen how to do the trace table. Now, if you have the answer correct, and you had a trace table, you got the 5 marks. I generally looked at the answer, looked at if you had any form of proof to what the calculations were to determine the answer, then you got the 5 marks, even if your trace table might have been incorrect. If you just wrote down the answer, you only got 4 of the possible 5 marks. Now, for the next one, let's just close that. I must say I'm slightly disappointed with the results here, but I'm not too surprised, because from this question I could see who attends class and who does not attend class. So, for this question, using what is already defined and declared, the given part up here, write the necessary Visual Basics code for the following. So firstly, you had a class called owner, you had a private name as string, private dog array as dog, and private contact as string, and then you had a dog class, which is a private underscore as integer. So this is composition. And then you have the 3 dots just indicating your constructors, your property methods, and the additional things that are listed underneath. We just didn't list everything as it's not necessary for the questions. So question 3.1, declare a double variable called underscore hunger, which must be directly accessible by all classes within the dog inheritance array. Now, the moment you see that, directly accessible by all classes within the dog inheritance hierarchy, what does that tell you? What's the access modifier going to be? Protected, that is correct. So if you started with public or private or shared, your question was marked incorrectly immediately. If you did not start with protected, I didn't even look at the rest of it, it's marked incorrect. If you said protected and you said underscore hunger or hunger, even if you made the left out of the underscore, I gave you the mark. So the keyword there is protected. 3.2. Define a utility function that will change the number to 0 if the number an integer provided is negative. So let's open up Notepad for this. So in Notepad, if you look at what you wanted, let's make some space here. So define a utility function that will change the number to 0, change the number to 0 if the number an integer provided is negative. So firstly, you see you've got a provided number. So here, I didn't really look at your modifier. Some people say private, some people say protected, some people say public. I accepted it regardless of what it said. So we've got a public function. The name I didn't really look at. So you could have named it anything and made sure you had a integer value and an integer return. So that part, if that was correct, you got 1 mark. After that, you had to check the value. So if that value, let's check the negative first. If the value is less than 0, then you have to return a 0, which means you return a 0 if the value is less than 0. If it is 0, then it is 0. But if it's less than 0, you return a 0. So if that was less than or equal to 0, it was also accepted. And if you said, if it's more than 0, return the value, that was also accepted. But that essentially gave you 1 mark for the first return. Then the other condition. So you could have gone else return value, and then end the if statement, and then end the function. Just line them up. Or you could have gone end if and return the value. So if that didn't execute, then you return the value, which is also correct. No, because the question says utility function, which means there is a return. So if you don't have a return, it's wrong. So if you didn't have a function, it was marked incorrectly. I then looked at your if statement logic, and if you made one mistake in the if statement logic, you lost all 3 of your marks. Okay, so let's do all the variations quickly. You've got one statement. So let's look at this one. You've got one statement that checks if it's a negative value, returns a 0 if it's a negative value, and then ends the if and returns the value. So if it's a negative value, it will return the 0 and the rest will not execute. If it's not a negative value, the if statement will jump out of the cycle or out of the check and return the value, because then it's a positive value. If you then wanted to do the other form of this, if you check the positive value, so if it's larger than 0 or equal larger than 0, you would return the value itself because it's positive. And if it's not positive, you would either have a else return 0 end if, or you could have gone end if and return the 0. But ultimately, if the value is negative, you return a 0. If the value is not negative, you return the value itself. I made sure that both of those conditions are executed. If you missed one of the two, you lost a mark. If you used the subroutine, you lost a mark because it says utility function. It doesn't say utility subroutine. You guys need to learn the distinction between the two. If we tell you to do a function, you do a function. Function as a return type. Right, so let's look at the question. So even if you used a sub but had a byte parameter, it's wrong? Yes, because you had to use a function. It was told in the question, define a utility function. Right.
Good morning.
Hold on, let me just get to the other typed questions. It is like set the value inside the if statement, then return afterwards. Oh, so that is fine, but that means you have to have a temp as integer. You would go temp equals value. Temp equals 0. And then at the end, you'll just return the value. That is also fine. because you do the if statement and you return the value. My concern was whether you return the correct value, irrespective of whether you use a temporary variable to check it or not. As long as you return the correct value, you got the 2 marks. If you only returned one of the correct values, you lost 1 mark. And if you didn't return either of the two, I checked if you have a valid function and you got 1 mark there. Otherwise, you got 0 out of 3. Would we be wrong to create local variables to store the amount given and just return the local variable? Okay, well, that is what I just said, so that is acceptable. Why did you use public? Like I said, it didn't matter if you used public, private, or protected, I still accepted it. It depends on what the intended use of the utility function is. If you tend to use it in all the inheritance hierarchy, you could have used protected. If it's only intended for the class itself, you could have used private. So I didn't go to that because it depends on how you interpret the intended use of this utility function. All right. The person that has his or her hand raised. Did I answer your question? Okay. Right. That's why I just wanted you to hold on for a moment while I deal with the others, because it most likely would have been one of the variations. Right. So are there any more questions regarding 3.2? Any other variations that people took that I did not cover in the discussion? Yes.
So it would be wrong if you did not declare a local value, a local variable, and you just used the value inside the parameters of the function, and then you set that equal to 0, then you return it afterwards.
Like what I'm doing here, or are you referring to the fact that you set the value to 0?
Yeah, instead of declaring a local variable, I just use the parameter of the function, set it equal to 0 if it's less than 0, then retain the value after the if statement.
So you essentially had
Less
return
than
value or value equals 0 and then return the value.
I had less. If value is less than 0, then the value is equals to 0, and then retain the value after the if statement.
Like so.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fine, because you return the correct value.
Oh, okay. Thank
Like I said, if you return the correct value on both cases, when it's a negative and a positive, you got both your marks, regardless of how you checked it. Because like you've seen, there's a few ways you can get the correct value to return. If you only return one of the correct values, so if you only return if it's a negative, or if you only return if it's positive, you lost 1 mark. If you don't return either one of those, because I saw a few people where they didn't have any returns, you check the values, but you had no returns, you lost both of your marks. And if you don't have a valid parameter list or you don't have a valid return, then you lost the last mark. Right. So let's move on to 3.3. I think I've covered most of the potential answers that I've seen in 3.2. 3.3 is provide an appropriate property method for the instance variable happiness. Note that any input must be validated to ensure that values are not negative. Now, here I've seen some very interesting things. So I think your mic is still unmuted. If you can just mute again there, unless you have a question.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. So here, once again, the importance was the property method for happiness as integer. So the first thing I looked at is whether you had happiness, whether you had the brackets there or not. It doesn't matter. That but one line. If you had a value here, you lost that 1 mark because happiness is not an array. Happiness, as listed above, is just a instance variable, single instance variable of integer. It's not an array. So the moment you did this, you lost 1 mark. But if you had happiness as an integer or with the brackets, you got that 1 mark. And the next mark came from the get, just returning the corrective value. So that got you a mark. If you call the validation method here, I think I gave you a pity mark because you're still returning the correct value. Otherwise, I subtracted 1 mark if this return was incorrect, or if you don't return this at all. Remember, you have to return happiness. If you return anything else, you lost that 1 mark. In the end get, a lot of you did not follow the correct structures. I was more concerned about the return here than the get and end get. So as long as you had the return within something that suggests it's the get part compartment, it was accepted. So if you forgot the end get, you still got the mark. But if you forgot the get itself, you did not get the mark. Then for the set has to have a value as integer. So that got a mark if you had that. If you did not have, if you had the set without the value, you lost that mark. Then there's 2 ways in which you can approach this. One is you can use the utility function you had previously. So this is called the function validate. Whatever you called the function, you would have called that name, just pass the value to it, and that would have given you 3 marks itself. Even if you forgot the end set and then the end property method. Just hold on until I've discussed the various options. Right, so that's one option here. So it's 1 mark for the name, 1 mark for the return, 1 mark for the set and value. So if you left out this value, it doesn't have to be called value, it can be called anything, but if you have that, you got 1 mark, and 3 marks for the validation. Now, if you did not use the utility function you created, and you checked the validation yourself, so you checked the value is less than 0 or less than or equal to 0, and then you made happiness 0, you got 2 marks for that. So you could have had the end f, and then if it was not negative, you made happiness the value itself, then you got 3 marks for validation. If you only checked one of the conditions, you got 1 mark for setting the value, but you lost 2 marks because your validation is incorrect. All right, so if you had proper validation, checking both returns, you got the full 3 marks for the validation itself. If one of your returns are incorrect, you only got 1 out of the 3 for the validation because your validation returns the wrong value itself. Right, so let's go with the hand first because you were first.
For the set, I said happiness is equals to validate, then put happiness again in the bracket. Is it wrong?
Yes, because the value is what needs to be validated.
So I'll lose 1 mark.
You would lose. So if you go happiness equals validation underscore happiness, it never sets the value. So you would have lost all 3 of those marks.
Okay, sir.
Right, because remember, if you do this set will never work. because that value never actually gets tested. This validation means nothing because that value is just going to make what it is the same value, which means this entire property method is incorrect. It doesn't function. If you validate it before the get, no, you had to validate it inside the section, otherwise we're doing unnecessary calculations. So if it's not with inside the get or the set, you lost those marks. It is a return happiness up here. Get returns the value, set changes the value. Right, I think I missed 2 questions. Yes. So do you get continuous marks? So if you get 3.3 wrong, what applied to it? What applied it to 3.4? Quickly how the marks work. We'll get to that when we get to 3.4. If you got 3.2 wrong, would be marked wrong using it within 3.3. No. So if your 3.2 was wrong and you used your validate function in 3.3, I assumed your function works as intended and you got 3 marks for the validation because you knew to call your validation irrespective of whether that function actually works or not. So I didn't base these 3 marks based on what you had in 3.2. I based it on whether you actually used it or not. Because 3.2 assumes you had the correct validation, and with that assumption, you would have used that function inside your property. So you would not have lost the 3 marks if your validation function itself was wrong. Yes, essentially, it's 3 marks for the property method and 3 marks for validation. Valid validation. So if you had the property itself, if you had the name correct, so you had your property with no parameters inside those brackets, or even if you had no brackets and the correct return, you got a mark. If you had the correct return over here, you got a mark. If you had the set with a parameter, you got the mark, 3 marks, and then you got 3 marks for valid validation. Keep in mind, I say valid validation. If you had incorrect validation, you only got 1 out of the 3 marks. No, you could have had it with brackets or without brackets. I prefer putting brackets in, but you can use it without brackets. It doesn't matter. There is an underscore there. There it is. It's just a bit small. Okay. Any other questions regarding 3.3? Yeah, 3.3. Pretty straightforward. If you've been doing your own practicals, then you should not have struggled with this. If you do not do your own practicals, then this would have been slightly trickier for you because you are probably not coming to class either. And I can see, we can see from the test who doesn't attend class, whether it's live or recording. So if you said value equals validate value in the get, would that be wrong? Only if you never change the actual happiness. If you never change the happiness, then you lost whatever marks is with the set. If you change the happiness based on the validation, so if you validate a value first, so let's say you did value equals validate value, and then you change the value, and that would be accepted. If you said happiness equals validate under, yes, that is the first example that I gave. That's the very first example that I gave. That is what was the intended answer. If you did the if statement in here once again, and you have a mistake in your if statement, then you lost potentially 2 marks out of the validation. So I suggest wait until you get your papers back, look at what you did, and then see how it was marked. You can either come back to the TUT, or you can contact me if you think it wasn't marked correctly, but I can assure you I looked at it fairly in terms of what is actually being set and what is not being set. Remember, if you don't do validation, you lost the marks. If you never actually set the happiness under set, then why would I give you marks for that function? Because it means that entire set doesn't actually work. So you would get 0 there if you never set happiness. Right, any other questions regarding 3.3? Right, if there's no more questions, let's move on to 3.4. Now, 3.4, define a constructor that accepts a single integer parameter that is used to ensure that the underscore dogs array is correctly allocated in memory. So you would have seen inside owner, you've got underscore dogs as an array, and we just need to go and resize that array. So all we expected of you is just to resize the array. So what would you have done? You would have created your public. Once again, I didn't really look at the modifier. So for those that said private or protected, you got a mark if you had a valid subroutine with a value inside as an integer. So that was worth 1 mark if you had the end sub. Keep in mind, if you had a valid subroutine, so public sub, end sub, you got a mark. Then, if you restem your array, underscore dogs as value, you got 2 marks for that. So you got 1 mark for the reader, 1 mark for the array being reset. Please note that if you're not resetting the correct array or array, yes, yeah, or array, you lost 1 of those 2 marks. So if you had readem and the wrong array, you lost both of those marks. If you had resized.array, you lost both of those marks because you were supposed to use readem as it's been taught like that. If you had your subroutine, you got a valid mark, and if you had a parameter list, you got a valid mark. So 2 marks, subroutine and parameter, 2 marks, redeeming the correct array. Now, if you had anything else in there, I simply just drew a line through it, indicating I've seen it, but it was not evaluated in terms of what was being looked at. So if you had anything else in there, anything else would have just been ignored because it doesn't contribute to the mark, and I also didn't let it reduce your marks. Now, if you did this within a for loop, then I reduced your marks. I think I penalized you with 1 marks if you did within a for loop. But if you just did the readem, resized your array, irrespective of what you added, you still got the 2 marks for it. So 1 mark for a valid subroutine, 1 mark for the parameter that was supposed to be there. So at least the 1 parameter. There were a few people that added additional parameters for anything else, but that was just simply ignored. If you did a loop after the array, I just drew a line through the loop, indicating that I've seen it. But if you did the readem outside the loop, you got the mark. Because a lot of you went and said for as int 1 to value. A lot of you did the following. A lot of you went and did the following. So I would have marked, given you the 2 marks there, given you the 2 marks there, and simply have just drawn a kind of like a wavy line through this. it indicates that I've seen it, but it doesn't reduce your marks. So I've just ignored everything else. I only looked for this line. Everything else I just simply ignored. Unless you did this inside your for loop. If you did that inside your for loops, I subtracted a mark or 2 marks, depending on what was wrong with your resize itself. But ultimately, what we were looking for is your validation, your function, your subroutine call, and the parameter, and the resize of that value. That's all I looked for. Anything else was just simply ignored. So anything else didn't reduce your marks unless it was inside a for loop. Right. But most of you had this in any case. The additional things, well, I just drew a line through it because it's based on how you consider the constructor itself. But as long as you had the things that I was looking for, you got the marks. All right. Question being asked, why would it be wrong to read them inside the loop? Why would you read them inside the loop? What are you redoing inside the loop? You first have to set the array. You did. This. You're redoing this array value of times. So let's say you've got 10 dogs. You're redoing this 10 times the same value. It's redundant. It's wasteful. That's why you lost the mark. This is not logical. It's like me telling you to write your name on your paper 16 times and only once is necessary. All right. Moving on. Question 3.5, provide a subroutine named pet that will increase the variable happiness by 1. When called, note the happiness cannot exceed 100. Now, this is where I saw some very interesting things. Keep note, subroutine. So in this case, you would have had an empty subroutine. It would have been named pet. Some of you left out the brackets. You would have seen that I've drew in the brackets in red as well, but you still got the marks even if you had no brackets there. If you had a parameter inside this bracket, then I removed that mark depending on what that value is, but essentially you just want a subroutine that increases happiness by 1. So you know the increase, you know the variable, you had no need for any parameter input. So firstly, you would check happiness itself. Now there were a few different things that I saw here, so I'm going to try and discuss all of them, and then we'll look at the considerations afterwards. So the first one is, most of you went and checked whether happiness was less than 100. Then if it was less than 100, you would go underscore happiness plus equals 1, or you could have gone happiness equals unhappiness plus 1. That was a valid increase. Else, you would have gone underscore happiness and just set it to 100. So that was one of the valid values that I've seen. Now, before I look at what if you use a property method instead of the instance variable, that was accepted as well, but that would have been a waste as well. Because you're increasing the value, you're not decreasing the value, and the validation inside the property method checks for negative values, not positive values. If you use the property method itself, it was marked correctly. It was accepted. Now, the next thing that I want to discuss is if you had an equal to here, you lost 2 marks. So you got a mark for the subroutine, but the moment you add an equal to there, you lost 2 marks depending on how you use it. Because if it's happiness is less than or equal to 100, so the moment that happiness is 100, you're still increasing it by 1, which means you're exceeding 100, which means your return is incorrect. Your set value is incorrect. What if you just called underscore happiness in the else? Like I did there. What are you referring to? Essentially, you didn't have to do anything. You could have ended there. Because if you're checking that it's less than 100, and if this statement is not true, then it's most likely 100, depending on how you test this. So if this is your statement, if happiness is less than 100, then you increase by 1, then it means the moment that this is 100, that you don't check it anymore and happiness remains at 100. So this is also valid. Why would you check a loop? Happiness, to increase happiness, you would do it inside dog. Happiness is just a single value, it's not an array. I haven't seen anyone use a valid for loop to set happiness, because what you did is you most likely took happiness and treated happiness like an array, and then you lost marks there because happiness is not an array. And I didn't see anyone use happiness in terms of the dog array itself. The only thing you were asked was provide a subroutine named pet that will increase the variable happiness by 1 when called. Doesn't say anything about array here. Now, if you said equal to, then this is supposed to be 99. So I saw a few students doing that, which was accepted. If you said larger than or equal to 100, and then set the value to 100, then that was accepted as well, as long as if you increase the, after you do the end if you increase the value happiness by 1. What if you checked and set it to 0 if that was greater than 100? Provide a subroutine named pet that will increase the variable happiness by 1 when note that happiness cannot exceed 100. So you're going to go from 99 or from 100 to 0. That would be wrong. Yes, it cannot exceed 100. So the moment it reaches, it stops increasing. There's no condition here that says it needs to be set to 0. No. You weren't asked to check invalid conditions. You were asked to make sure it doesn't exceed 100. So the moment it reaches 100, it stops increasing. problem is a lot of you did stupidly overcomplicated things there that are not valid. Because you were only asked to check that it does not exceed 100. You weren't asked to output an error. And for those that put some form of text return, you would see this nice bold no that I wrote on your paper. Because you don't have text output in a subroutine like a message box. And I assume the people that did that didn't attend class, because we've said how many times you don't do message boxes inside a class. You don't do form-based things inside a class. A class is all about the actual calculations. You would return a string only if a function is used that returns a string. A subroutine has no return. It just sets a value. If happiness is more than 0 and happiness less than 100, yes, you could have checked that, but once again, it is increasing, and because your validation function inside happiness doesn't allow anything less than a 0, once again, you did not have to check a value less than 0. The only thing you have to check is whether it exceeds 100 or not. If it exceeds it, then you just keep it on 100, or you make sure it doesn't increase. That's all you need. It's simple as that. That's the only answer I was looking for. Is it 100 or not? If it's 100, you don't increase it. So I checked whether it exceeds 100 or not, and your mark was given based on that. Most of you that got 15 out of 17 lost your marks here because you did stupidly unnecessary things or things that were not requested from you inside this function. When you see a test, the test will ask you for something specific. You answer that something specific. Anything additional to that something specific that changes the actual requirements of that function reduces your marks. In your practicals, you can go as complicated as you want, as long as the function or the actual intended functionality of the program is there. In a test, the specific functionality requested from you from a subroutine or a function needs to be that specific execution. If you do anything more than that and alter the usage of that subroutine or function, will reduce your marks. Point blank, simple as that, nothing more, nothing less. And if you've been attending the tutorials, 10 to 1 says you would have received about 15 out of 17 for this, because we've discussed how to answer this in the tuts. And that was about the average. The average was about 15 out of 17, because of what a lot of you did in question 3.3 as well is you did internal validation. So instead of using the utility function, you did the validation inside the property method, but you checked one value and you only set it based on one value. You never actually checked the other side of the negative, which means you set it in one condition, and in the other condition, nothing happens, which means it remains a null reference, or it remains what it was when the constructor executed, which in both cases are wrong. So most of you lost a mark there, and most of you lost your second mark, I think it was over here, because you only tested one condition and you exceeded the 100 by 1. So depending on how far you exceeded, the moment you exceeded 100, I set a mark if you don't test both, if you don't set the value in both conditions. But the moment you receive 100 as your valid subroutine, regardless of how you got the mark. If you did anything other than checking whether it's 100 and setting it to 100, if it exceeds it, you lost marks. Because the intended use is increase by 1 until it reaches 100, then stop increasing. That's all you needed to do there. Any questions regarding question 3? Anything that was not any considerations that were not discussed. Look, the best way is to wait until you have your paper. If you have any other ways of doing this, because there were some very weird things that I've seen. Some of them works, some of them don't. If it works, then you most likely got your mark. If it does not, then you lost the marks. Simple as that. But because of the variations, I can't list every single possible execution of this because you'll have a few pages. Now, coming to the URL, UML. Please note, and this is important, your second semester test is practical. So I am aware of people that don't really have laptops to code this out will do this on paper. That is fine. But the first semester test was intended to be written, as in you would sit at a desk with a piece of paper and write this out. So if you gave us the code for this and never did your diagrams, you lost a lot of marks. That's all I'm going to say from the get-go. Because you had to draw this. Not code it, you had to draw it. If you had no diagram, you lost all of your marks, potentially. I do believe Mr. Gottschall went and then remarked those that did not have diagrams in terms of the actual definitions of the classes being created. But personally, for me, I would have given you 0 because it's UML. It's supposed to be drawn. Seeing as Mr. Cottrell is back, do you want to maybe tell how you marked question 4? I have the memo here for you if you want that as an overlay as well.
No, that's fine. Morning, everyone. I do apologize for not being here. I had to do a bit of personal matters. Unfortunately, Mr. van der Westhuizen's on the money. If you didn't give me a diagram, you got no marks. The question is UML. Thankfully, a lot of you are saved by 4.4 by make sure to use the correct notation and correct UML. That's kind of made some of you draw the diagrams, but I would then mark that. But if I had no diagram to mark, I just put a line through and gave you 0. Just scroll up, Mr. van der Westhuizen, to the beginning of the question. A lot of you did not actually read the question 4. Unified modeling language. What is unified modeling language, ladies and gentlemen? Is it code? Or is it what you draw every Friday for a practical? Yeah. A lot of you did not read that, and that's a big concern from my side, as you aren't reading the questions, you're just diving head in. Okay, so I gave marks for what I could give marks for, but when you get your papers back and you feel I maybe have undermarked or didn't do something incorrectly, you can check. But just scroll down. Thank you. A bit further. You had to have a base class called entertainment. It had to be abstract. It had to have 2 attributes and a method. What the attributes and methods, not really concerned with as long as it made sense. Question 4.2. That is to draw 2 derived classes from entertainment. Now, that could be anything. I had movies, books, cartoons, games, you name it. That could have been anything that is an entertainment, and then you'd have to have 2 attributes and a method for each of those. That's inheritance to the 4.1 class. 4.3 was composition involving one of the classes in 4.2. So one of your derived classes had to show composition. So you had to have and it all had to make sense. You couldn't have a, I don't know, I had a restaurant being entertainment or something weird. I had very weird logic presented to me in terms of the UML. So 4.2 considered logic and notation. So if the logic didn't make sense, you lost the mark. If there's a notation error, you lost the mark. If you use the wrong symbol, you lost the mark. What I meant by wrong symbol, if you used a diamond for composition and was an open diamond, you lost a mark. Because that's aggregation or composition. Composition is a solid diamond. So I looked at that type of stuff when marking. Once you get it back, most of you thankfully did a diagram at some stage and you got the marks for that. But unfortunately, a lot of you did the code, and I'm not sure why. It didn't make sense to me, but I'm guessing the people that did the code are the ones that never have done UML properly or never had listened to class. So would a theme park inherit entertainment? Yes. You're finally catching the hint for the practical 7. Ladies and gentlemen, what is the point of Prac 7? Then you should be fine. Prac 7 asked you to create a base class theme park and then have inheritance from it. It is designed specifically to help you guys get prepared, because it would force you to come up with classes for a theme park. Like this one can force you to come up with classes for entertainment. So Prac 7 was actually in line to help you with that. Mr. van der Westhuizen is the one that made sure of that, to help you guys maybe get through question 4. But I was kind of in shock when I saw code, because as the question said, UML diagram, UML class diagrams, no mention of code. Okay, thank you. So that was kind of, a lot of you did okay, not fantastic, but some of you did it perfectly, some of you did it fairly okay. Some of you, I don't know what happened. You gave me some of the code, I just put a line through it. I'm not considering it because it wasn't part of the question. It had nothing to do with the question. That means you just didn't bother to read the full question, which is a bit of a concern. Okay. Any questions on the UML? Okay, and ladies and gentlemen, the UML will appear in your exam again. So it's not going away. So please, if you made the stuff up in the semester test 1, that's fine. Not the end of the world. It counts 25%. We can move on. Your semester test 2 is a practical, which is 65%. Did the base class have to be abstract? Yes, because look at question 4.4. It says consider the abstract class called entertainment. Okay, but if you didn't do it abstract, I didn't actually deduct that many marks, so don't worry. So in your exam, you will draw UML diagrams, not write code. Please read your questions carefully. It's a bad habit a lot of students have, and a bad habit a lot of people have, is not fully reading a question before answering it. There's not much more I can say. If you have any other questions, post them in chat. But Mr. van der Westhuizen, I think we're going to go on with other work, or have you done that already?
No, I started the memo, with the memo discussion.
Okay. Are there any other questions about it? You guys are all gone quiet now. Okay, it's audio's on if I'm not mistaken.
So how would we actually show that entertainment is the abstract class?
By writing the keyword abstract.
Oh,
In the notes, there's a diagram of abstract classes, and all you do is above. Thank you, Omar, in chat. That's how you indicate abstract, above your class name. And ladies and gentlemen, we're not being funny. A lot of you, we know who attends class and who doesn't, and we could see it who attends and watches the recordings, because we could see in your code, your definitions, all of that kind of reflected if you're doing the work. Now, when it came to, if he didn't write it, I didn't deduct that many marks. It would have been maybe 1 mark out of the entire thing. I was very lenient on that section. I was more looking for your logical connections than anything else. If the abstract was more about notation, so don't stress too much. Okay. Any other questions? Am I assuming I'm taking over now, Mr. Van der Vestos, and then you disappearing?
I'm still here. Do you want me to do the blind class, or do you want to do it?
Please, I'll be background today. I'm not that. Unfortunately,
It's fine, I'll do it.
This morning's tasting did not. Screw it. They took about 6 vials of blood from me this morning. I'm still freaking lightheaded.
Fun times. Okay, so for those that have had a look, let me get the practical up and running for you guys, so that I can show you what is expected of you for this week. I think I'm sharing the full screen now.
Okay, the final answer to recursion. A minus 1 times B plus C plus B times 5, I think.
Wait, let me. It is, the final answer was A minus 1 C times B plus 5.
There you go.
There were some interesting variations that I've seen. Ultimately, if that was your answer, it was accepted. I'm assuming you were slightly late to the tut.
He said he was.
Oh, okay. I didn't see that.
Well,
It's
that's
fine.
why
Surprised to see you in the morning. I normally see you in the afternoon. Then again, I normally skip the morning as well.
he attends both.
All right. So for this week's tutorial, I'm not going to read the entire thing, but the practical that's due on Friday has to do with a zoo-ish theme, zoo wildlife kind of theme. So, okay, let's actually maybe go through the entire thing. It's almost holiday time, and instead of knocking back drinks on a beach, you have decided to go to do some volunteer work at the various national parks in South Africa. With your amazing IT skills, you have been tasked with designing and developing a Visual Basics application that will help National Parks Management with documenting the various wildlife they have on their parks. So for question A, or section A, create a class called wildlife with the following attributes. You've got a tracker ID, a rarity level, a sighting months and least month. You've got a string, integer, an array of integers, a string and an integer. Tracker is a tracker assigned to wildlife. So you've got an example of that. So you can see that it includes alphanumerical characters. Rarity level of wildlife, 1 to 5, 1 for common, 5 for rare. So you have a range here, 1 to 5. So you want to make sure that you don't exceed that. Sightings, integer as an array, times wildlife spotted each month. So you have an example of that. You've got months, integer, number of months that the wildlife is monitored for, and that will probably be used to set your array. I'm not going to give you all the answers, but essentially you've got your values being stored there. And least month where wildlife was was least spotted. So you see it's a calculated and stored value. So it's calculated, but it's also stored. So that will probably be a function or subroutine. Only underscore citing has a property method. You read that. Only underscore citings has a property method. It's there. It's in the PDF. In addition, wildlife also has the following methods. A constructor that accepts the parameters underscore ID tracker or tracker ID, underscore rarity level, and underscore months. Then you've got a calculate average or a calc average, calculates and returns the average of the underscore citings array. Keep in mind that you're not allowed to use the built-in functions to determine an average for the array. You have to calculate it yourself. You've got lowest sightings, method that calculates the month in which the wildlife was least spotted. This value is stored in underscore least month and then returns the actual number of sightings, not the month's number, but the sightings in that month. You calculate rarity rating, a method that returns a rarity rating A, B, C, or D based on the following table. So this table tells you where they're supposed to be. Sightings less than or equal to 15 will be C, B, and A, based on the rarity, and then the sightings above 15 have a different rating. Yes, there's an average function for an array. You can calculate the average by doing the array name.average, and that will calculate the average for you, but you're not allowed to use it. Right. The above must be implemented using a select case and 3 if statements. So calculate rarity rating may differ in derived classes. So you already know it's going to be an overridable function. Override, not most override, because it has calculations already set at the base class. Then you've got display, provides the wildlife tracker, rarity level, average sightings, display up to 2 decimal places using the format command. The least sightings and the rating data must be presented in this exact order in a single line as follows, giving you an example of what the output should look like in terms of separation. In addition, create the following classes with which inherit from wildlife. The following table contains the additional properties and methods for the 2 derived classes. So you've got lion, you've got the additional things that need to be there, and then the additional functions or overrode functions. So calculate rarity rating, and this just returns a C. You've got rhino, and its calculate rarity rating just returns an A. So those are the 2 that we're going to be focusing on today, is the fact that these overriding functions, or the functions that are overriding the base class function, is returning different values from what the base class does in the table. Then questions C, D, F, and G must be answered using separate methods. Each of the questions must be answered within its own function, subroutine, or event such as button click. So we've got question C, using a single array instantiate objects to store information of the different lions and rhinos, the number of wildlife, types of wildlife, whether that's rhino or lions, and values for each wildlife will be input by the user of the program. So everything will be given to you basically. You may assume that all lines are mentioned, all lines are monitored at the same, for the same period of time. In D, using the single array created in question C above, display the details of all the wildlife in the multi-line text box. So you need to use a rich edit box. It's told you have to use it, which means you have to use it. Without removing existing code, the Director General of National Lions Park would like your program to calculate the rarity rating of all lions and rhinos by following the table provided in the wildlife class. And then there's a hint given, requires the use of my class. Note it says without removing existing code, which means you're going to add code. Using downcasting, determine and display the number of Rhino objects in the array, and then determine the total number of rhinos in the park. This will be the sum if the rhinos. This would be the sum if the rhino in the crash. Okay. Now, the question comes with question E, the my class. I had a few questions about that, and we'll be discussing that. All right, so there was a question. Let's look at that quickly. Sorry for going back. So for the recursion function in the test, if I assumed A equals 5, then instead of minus 5, C times B plus 5, I had C. Will it be in, will I get any marks? Yes, you would lose 1 mark. So you get 4 if you did the trace table, and that was your final output. Because you did not write the A. Keep in mind, the question did ask you, we go back to that, the question tells you, consider the following, consider the Visual Basic codes below. What does it calculate in terms of A, B, and C? So you have to write it in terms of A, B, and C. Right. But getting back to this, the question comes in with my class. A lot of you have never seen the usage of my class before, and I'm going to show that to you now. Yes, please, if you were late to the tutorial, I mentioned it in detail in our discussions. You can download the tutorial and go and watch it. I'm not going to repeat it 700 times because then the people watching the recordings will stop watching the recordings. It's the same as if you're late to class. All right. So let's start a new project so that we can demo this my class. It's a fairly easy concept. It was very briefly touched on before, but let's actually show you what we're going to do. So let's do let's just call it tut. And I don't know what tut it is, so we'll just go with the date. September. Yeah, September. It's not exactly the same as my base. It is something different to my base, but I'll show you. So what we're going to do, we're just going to add one button here. I'm going to call it PNT, but let's call it do something. PNT do something. We'll just say do something. Just for the sake of having a button on our screen. But let's add a multi-line text box here. So rich text box. I'm just going to call it red box. Just for the sake of convenience. And let's just rename our form. That. Right. So let's begin by creating a base class. So in this case, I'm going to call my base class, we'll just call it base class. Add our option statements, so option strict, option explicit, option infer, and now we can rig it. So we're going to give our base class a name, just for the sake of having a name. we're going to give our base class two values. And we'll do our property methods. Subject name, string. Right. And then we're not going to have a constructor because we'll just use the default constructor here. So we're going to have one function that's overridable. So let's go public overridable function display, and our display will return a string. And in this case, what we're going to display is, let's return, this is the base class. I just have instance variables here for the sake of having instance variables. We're not actually going to use them in this example unless you guys want us to do that after I've shown you this. So I've got one overridable function that is display. So the base class says this is the base class, and now we're going to create another class, which is going to be our derived class. And our derived class, we're just going to call child. Child inherits from our base, and then we'll just add a another value just for the sake of having the value. And we're going to do our public overrides function display, which will return the string. And this is just going to simply return, this is the So what currently is happening here, I've got a base class. A base class has 3 instance variables with the property method set, just for the sake of having them, so we can just close these. And it has one overridable function called display. So display will return a value that says this is the base class. And we've got one derived class that it inherits from base, one instance variable, one property method. It inherits all the other property methods as well. And then one overrides function that overrides display. It returns this is the derived class. So you see I have polymorphism. I have 2 display functions and I'm overriding the display function from the base class. Why am I doing this is so that I can show you the difference between my base and my class. So let's go and add our option statements. We'll add one variable. Let's call it objects as base. Just for the sake of our base class. So what we're going to do is, first thing, we're going to resize this. So I'm going to do it manually, because otherwise you guys are going to steal my code. But I'm just going to set it manually, so we'll redim it, and let's redim it to about 5 objects. 5 or 6 objects, the 6 objects. Then I'm going to randomly create 6 objects. So I'll go objects 1 equals new base. I want to establish 1 or 2 of them as my base class. And the others I want to establish as a derived class. So let's go 12 for this one. We'll do 1 more base. And then the rest we'll do child. Now, why it's not complaining because of the brackets is because we are using the default constructors. Look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Everybody with me so far. Nothing new yet. So we have a base class. We've got a derived class with a polymorphism implementation of display. So we're overriding the base class's version of display. I'm creating a single array of type base, and I'm just instantiating 6 objects, 2 of type base and 4 of type child. So is there anything new there yet? You all understand what this basic structure is right now, right? Okay, so everybody's with me. So I'm going to create a simple output. So let's use, I'm going to use index as integer equals 1 to 6. And my red box, which is my multi-line text box, my rich text box, which I just renamed red box. I'm going to append what is already inside of it, and I'm going to add the output of objects index.display. And I want each display on a new line, so let's just go and add a new line function. Okay. So thus far, is there anything new? You all understand what's going on here. So we run this program, just so that I can show you the output. I might have to magnify this in a second. Let's just get the magnification in. Okay. I'm assuming you can all see this. I can't see the text at the moment. So what's going to happen here? Can you see the magnification? Is it showing the form? Can you see the cursor? Yes, okay. So if I click this button, what's going to happen? Let's just do that. So if I click on this button, it's going to create 6 objects, 2 of type base, 4 of type child, and it's going to output the return of the dot display function. And if we look at what we're doing inside these functions, for everything that's of type child, we expect to see this is the derived class, and for everything of type base, we expect to see this is the base class. Everybody agree with me there? Okay, sorry, I have to scroll on the screen to actually see what you guys are saying. So, what's happening? This is of type base. So if we go to our code, let's see which ones are being expected. So 1 and 3 is of type base, and 3, 2, 4, 5, and 6 is of type derived. So you've got 2 base classes and 4 derived classes. So the output is exactly what we expected. Oh, you can zoom in yourselves. Okay, thank you. Oh, that's going to make it so much easier for me. The split screen on this machine, the zoom, it zooms in the entire screen, so it handles both screens as one, which makes it a bit difficult to see what you guys are seeing. All right, so you've got 2 of type base, 4 of type derived, so you can see the derived functionality or the polymorphism there as the same function is being called and different results are being outputted. Now, we're going to add another function. I'm going to call this function, it's just going to be public, a regular function called more display or base display. Doesn't actually matter what we call it. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to return my base dot display. Now, firstly, why is it giving me an issue here? Why is it going to give me an issue? You can tell me. Let's see who's focusing. So this is the base class. I'm calling my base dot display. Why is this specific class giving me an issue with this?
Because we're inside the base class.
Because we're inside the base class. So it's not display, not a member of object, which base class technically inherits from objects, and display is not a method that's inside that object. Only derived classes can use my base. Yes. Technically, based on the Visual Studios, yes. So we'll keep it at that. You're not inheriting from something here, so there is no base. My class, you all understand me. Let's go to value 1. Do you all understand that? What does that do? When do we use me dot value 1? Oh, you guys never seen me.
They've never done shadowing.
Okay. So let's go. This is actually supposed to be underscore though. So I'm just going to and this is I need to convert let's do name. Name is actually of type string.
Also play the me so they can see what happens without it.
Okay. Right. So right now, you guys see I've got a name here, and I've got a name there, and they're exactly the same. Do you see they're exactly the same? All right. Now, can you see this is giving me an issue? It's giving me an issue because option strict giving me an issue because this name and that name is the same. Please don't tell me it's going to resolve it itself. Yes. All right. Now,
No.
do you see there it says parameter?
Hmm.
Parameter underscore name as string. So if I say underscore name here and underscore name there, which one am I referring to in here? Aside from the fact that I'm highlighting it now. No, it's referring to the property method.
The parameter.
And if I say me, sorry, the parameter refers to the parameter here because it says, you'll see if I highlight it, it says parameter, but now you see I added the me. Now it says the base dot underscore name. So now it's highlighting up there. So this is shadowing. Shadowing is if you have two variables of the same name. So in your function list, if you have the same name in your parameter list as a variable, if you call them me, it refers to the global variable. Well, in this case, we're going to refer to it as the global or the instance variable. And if you don't add the me, it uses the variable inside the parameter itself. So the me refers to our global references. And without the me, it refers to our parameter references. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove that. And I'm going to return display. All it's going to do is just going to call the display function. That's all it's going to do. Keep in mind. So we go to our implementation. We go dot. Does it do something? Do, what did we call it? Base display. Sorry, we called it base display. Base display. The base display is inside our base class, so we can still call it. And all it's going to do is going to call the display function. Now, my question is, when I call this inside our code, and I call this of type child, which display is going to execute, the base class display or the child class display? All right, so let's see who's right. I've got my form. And remember, type child has an overwritten display function, which means if it overrides a function, the override function will execute. So I've got once again 2 of type base and 4 that execute the derived class version of the display, which is the overwritten function. You all see that. You're all comfortable with that. All right. But let's say for some reason, I only want to execute the base class version of display. I don't want to execute the derived class versions of. I don't want to execute the overwritten display. I want to execute this display, specifically this class's display. I want to execute my class's display. So I would go my class display, and my class is currently inside base class, so my class is the base class. If I execute my class inside child, then my class would be the child class. So it's within the current class you are, that is my class. So I want to execute my class's display function, which means I want to execute this specific display function. So if I go to my code, executing the same function, the only difference is I'm calling my class. What do you expect the output to be this time? So we call it, and it calls the base classes, or it calls my class. It calls the class in which we are currently calling it. So my class refers to this specific class, and this specific class's version of the display. So even though display is being overwritten inside the child class, what's happening is my class specifies that I don't want the overwritten function. I want this class's version of that function, which will execute that specific output. So from the base class, you can't do that. So if you don't add my class, it will execute the derived class's version. But if you add my class, it will execute the current class version. There's nothing that can force a parent to use a derived class. If it's overwritten, it will use the derived class version. So it's not forcing the child to execute its version. If the child overwrites, it's going to overwrite. So there is no function like that. If you want to force it to use a child's version, then it's a must inherit and a must override, because then you're forcing it to use the child's version of it. So you're referring to something like a must override. All right. So keep in mind, this is now for if you have something of multiple types inside a base array. I'm just going to call it a base array at this point. But if you want to force it to use a specific class's version of a function, you would call my class inside that function, inside that class. Because my class refers to my class, my current class, the class I'm in. All right, we've got a hand. If you got your hand up, you can talk.
So can you hear me?
I can hear you.
So when we call the my class, does it only call for the base class, or does it implement what we did in the base class to all the classes?
No, it's not what you did in the base class, it's what you're doing in the current class.
Yeah. So will it implement that formula to all the other classes?
It forces it to use that class's version of the function.
So in all the objects created, which does not depend on which class you created.
So, a different way to explain it. If I have, let's say I add another derived class here, and I add another override display function. The display itself has an overwritten value. So you can see it's overridable. The child overwrites that display function. So when a type child object is encountered and you call display, it's going to execute the derived class's version of that display, the one that's being overwritten. My class as it suggests, is my class, the current class I am in. So if you type my class, it forces that implementation, whether there is a derived object or not, it forces that version of the implementation to be used, which means that my class display will execute this specific display function, regardless of whether it's being overwritten or not. So even if we're overriding it in a derived class, like we're doing in this case, the my class forces it to use the current class's version of that function. Does that answer your question? Does that answer your question? To a certain extent, it turns off polymorphism. Okay, but I'm assuming you're still here, so I'm going to ask this again. Oh, you left. Okay, so that's why he's not answering. Okay. I assume that answers the question.
He also can't come. The session's timed out.
Oh. Unless it's a disconnect, because then, yeah, okay, no, it's not reconnecting. All right. So that is the end of the session. So if you're still confused by this, come to this evening's tutorial. I will discuss my class again, or yeah, we'll discuss my class again, and we'll discuss it on Thursday again. So I'm going to use this exact same example tonight, and then on Thursday we'll discuss it again in the Q&A. Otherwise, just go and practice it. Go and play with it. See what it does. See how it's used. Obviously, I'm not giving you a more concrete example because then you're just going to copy and paste it for your prac on Friday. So I'm giving you a bit of an ambiguous example to show you what it does. But in any case, time is up. We are over time slightly. So please make sure you attend your lectures. We'll discuss it on Thursday as well. And then tomorrow we're starting with files. That's going to be an interesting lecture. All right, guys. So I'll see you tomorrow. Have a lovely evening, and please start working on your practical. Once you start working on your practical, you have all your base implementations there. It will be a lot easier for you to understand it once we go through this again, because then you'll see where it becomes useful. If you don't start your practical, the idea itself is going to confuse you more than anything else because you don't see how you're going to use it in your practical. So start your prac, come back on Thursday, see how we use it, and you'll understand exactly what's going on. All right, but I'll see you guys tomorrow.